Okay, Ninsa Ojik, Benen Dodem, Wedem Chiging Don Jaba. My Anishinaabe name is Ojik, and that means a fisher. The fisher is an animal that belongs to the weasel family. And all of you have heard of the Big Dipper, the constellation, but we have a different story of that, and that means Ojik Anang, the fisher star. And maybe someday you'll hear that story about that. But the main thing is that body of the dipper is the body of the fisher, and then the handle is his tail, and it's broken because he got shot by an arrow by his cousin. So why I start off with saying that is each of us here, maybe you have an Anishinaabe name, but when you know the Anishinaabe name, you got to learn the story behind that name, and then what fit that story within our grand Anishinaabe story and within our history as well. And then the other thing is what happens is we left a lot of things along the side of the road, as we say, and now we're picking them up. So sometimes the people will say, what's the word for Big Dipper? And then people that don't know that story, they say, Chiguabagan. And you guabage, you scoop out water or you scoop something. Guabagan is a dipper. So then that changed our understanding of the sky world, because we end up saying it, we just translated the English understanding and used the Anishinaabe word, instead of taking the whole Anishinaabe story and the Anishinaabe word that goes with it and honoring that story how we understand the universe. So it's the same thing with our history, our treaties, and our story. So with treaty, a lot of times we have a treaty, and you'll hear that we have now land claims, and there's differences in interpretation of what was agreed upon. So that's why we have now land claims. And then you hear sometimes that we have Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, and then sometimes you'll hear that other people will say, how come Indians get all this for free? And this is what, it takes a longer time to explain all this, but sometimes you'll get an understanding of it actually isn't for free. If you actually really looked at what we gave up in the deal and how we got the shorter end of the deal, then it actually is supposed to be, we're supposed to keep getting this as a benefit of the original proprietors and the original people of this land. So that's what this is about, looking at treaties in that way. So one of the first things that we try to talk about as well, in Ojibwe, we ask people what's the word for treaty. And in my area, I ask, I went and talked to an old man, and I asked him different things, and Tam Dashin Gi Mi Nao Asema. I gave him tobacco first to help me to understand. Nadamo Shin Win Sustama Gajawebak. Help me understand what happened. That's what I asked him. And so I gave him that tobacco, then he started talking about it. And when I was learning to speak Ojibwe, I knew the word to tell somebody a report or to narrate something. Somebody would say, Windamage. So he'd say, Mr. Corbiere, Darren, Gi Windamage. Darren told or gave a report. And then if you say Darren told the principal or his boss, then you'd say, Darren Gi Windamawan Gimaman. He told the boss or the chief. So the next part is then you say, in Ojibwe, the way our language works, we sometimes put the emphasis on the initial syllable to say that something was done over and over. So if I sat here for a long time, I'm just sitting now, I'd say, Ndon Namadap. But if I sat for a prolonged period, I'd say, Ndon Nam Dap. And I made that first part, Nam Dap, made it long. So the same thing when we talk about telling somebody something, we say, Wa Windamawa. Gi Wa Windamawa. And now we may, instead of saying we told them over and over, we say that means a promise. Gi Wa Windamawa. I promised him something. So the other thing we do in Ojibwe, we change, some of you students know Or you may have heard people say, those words are so long. Why do we have to have such long words? But if you look at those whole words in our language, that's actually a whole sentence. So when you take that whole English sentence, you put it by that Ojibwe word, same page length, same space on the page. It's no longer, no shorter. It's just we're more compact, putting everything into one. So the other thing we do is within the word, we can change the internal part of the word, and we say that you and I did this. So ngi wa win the madame. Me and this guy, we promised to each other. Ngi wa win the madame. We promised something to each other. So that's the word for us in our language for treaty. Wa win the madawin. A mutual promise, promising things together. That's what we say in Ojibwe for a treaty. So it's the same thing now today with Anishinaabe people. Here we say, Mr. Corbiere kinomage. Mr. Corbiere is teaching. Mr. Corbiere teaches. Mr. Corbiere kinomage. But we say, Mr. Corbiere is teaching young Anishinaabe people. Mr. Corbiere kinomowan Anishinaabe son. He's teaching young Anishinaabe. And then if they actually start, what the Anishinaabe people believe is that teaching and learning are a mutual two-way thing, that the teacher and the student actually teach each other. So then that's when we would say, Mr. Corbiere meanwhile, kinomaganan, kinomadok, they teach each other. So we do that same thing, we add that adok, adame in that word. So we look at wampum, and wampum is actually a word, what they call in the Algonquian language on the the east coast here. And some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that it's actually a saltwater organism. But how many of you watch Family Guy? You watch Family Guy? What's their town? And that's what this is. Quahog. I always say Quahog, but it's Quahog, I guess. So this is, I got this from Peter. Pass that on, Stewie. Just kidding. So that's actual wampum. So you see the purple edge there? That's the part that they would carve out and they would make into beads. And so you'll see here all the colors in here, part of the white. And that's a string of wampum. They make the beads, they make them into beads. So that's the one they use for purple. Now what I've been told is that's on the east coast. So here Anishinaabe people are surrounded by fresh water. So we would never have had that ourselves. But it's through trading networks that we receive that. And that's the one thing that I want to stress to you, is that a lot of people here, before we say before Pale people came here, we all traded with each other. And one of the things we traded as well was copper from this area. So we have wampum, which in our language we call migas, and we have misquabic, which is called red metal. So the people, when they would have, long time ago we didn't have pockets. Here's what they used to do, how they would wear their bag. They would wear their bag like this. And then sometimes later on, after they saw non-native people come, then they put their bags like this. Because they put what they call a powder horn. Bean doggen, they call that. Makade bean doggen, makade on, where they keep their gunpowder. But here's where they would keep that. And here's that white, real white wampum. So in our language we say miigis for that. And in here, this is a little cowrie shell. A friend of mine gave me this, and he said he got it from people when he was on the powwow trail, and they actually had this, and it was west of the Mississippi. But I've never seen this kind before, and it's also called miigis. The usual kind I see for that cowrie shell, that's also called miigis, is this kind here. And maybe Mr. Corbiere covered this story with you about the miigis and Anishinaabe people. So you see people also, Anishinaabe people, especially women, they'll make a stole and they put that, decorate that all around on themselves as well. So that's the miigis. But where we are from, how many of you have go swimming in the summer and dive for clams? So that's a clam is at the bottom of the lake and he makes a trail, right? At the bottom of the lake and he makes a trail. That one we call S. You know, you can almost like say the letter S. It sounds the same thing. So you learn the Anishinaabe word S. That means clam. So when you say S, instead of this, that's that clam in the fresh water, S. And the miigis is the one that's from the salt water in our language. So our word for wampum in our language is miigis. But then they started to make a lot of different things with this. And our enemies, the Haudenosaunee, were the ones that brought this to us. And then we also have a group of people on the eastern seaboard called Delaware. And there's a state called Delaware. And these guys, when they first met the non-native people, the Delaware were forced west. And they're forced west so many different times that they end up living in down in southern Ontario at a place called Moraviantown. But whenever those people came, they called themselves in their language Lenape. And you can almost hear it sound like Anishinaabe as a related language, just like how French, Spanish, and Italian are called Romance languages. Delaware, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Cree are called Algonquian languages. So there's some related language to it. But what I want you to think about as well with wampum is why would we use that? Why would Anishinaabe use that when they make a treaty? Why is it important to make that in a treaty? So we see this tail here. This was here at this table. But you see sometimes the eagle tail, nashkit, we call it nashkit in our language. And what they do with that tail, they take the 7 feathers off the bottom of that tail and then they string it like this. So they put 1 and then maybe they put 4 or maybe they put 5 strings of wampum between it, another 5, another feather, another 5, another feather, or maybe they put 7 in between each feather, or maybe 10. And then they take this string and then they hang it from what they call a calumet pipe, a big pipe. So those stems, those calumet stems, they would go from the tip of your finger to your heart. That's how big those pipes are. And then from there, they would hang this on the stem, this miigis, and that tail feather of the eagle. So you have on that wood for the stem, and then you have for the bowl that rock, and then you have this from the bottom of the ocean, and then you have those feathers from as high as the eagle flies. And we say that the eagle is the one that flies closest to the Creator. So when we make a treaty and we use wampum, we're saying from the depths of the ocean, this agreement will be abided by. And when we take that pipe and we take those feathers from way up high and we put it on that pipe and we say, as high as this eagle flies, that's how much this treaty is going to be heard and abided by. And then the stick, as straight as this pipe stem is, that's the veracity of our words. And the strength of this bowl, this stone, sin, the pipe bowl, as strong as that bowl is, that's as strong as my word. So that's what we talk about Anishinaabe people, Meanwhile, Haudenosaunee people, who we call Naudowik in our language, that we use this wampum to console ourselves and condole each other. And when they say they condole each other, they actually, when somebody passed away and they meet together, they say to each other, I take this string and I wipe your tears with it. Now, when you look, just how you looked at me, that's the exact reaction I wanted. Because now we think, how can this dry someone's tears? And that's how our ancestors talked. They said, with this string of wampum, I dry your tears. And with this string of wampum, I straighten your heart, so that we will be doing everything in accordance. And then they also used to say to each other when they're going to meet and treat each other, they would say, they take a feather and they say, but it would be the white tail feather of the eagle. And they say, I take this white feather, maybe you've walked a long distance and maybe there's dust in your eyes. I take this feather and I wipe the dust from your eyes. I take this feather and I wipe the dust from your ears, not the wax, the dust. And then they said, and I take this feather and then I set your heart aright. And so if you take that feather and you see that it goes from here to here, that's the thing that they would do. And they would say, now I take all this and I give you a drink of water. And they would also have there, instead of now we use this cloth, they would take a white deerskin and they would make it as soft as they possibly could. And he said, I take this as well and I dry your tears. And then I also wipe your feet with this, because maybe you walked a long way and your feet are sore, and maybe you walked through a path that had thorns and brambles and your feet are all cut up. So I'm going to take care of you, because you came a long way to come here to make a treaty with me, to exchange wampum with me, to exchange food with me, to exchange words with me, and that we're going to work together and we're going to call each other brother. That's what they used to say to each other. We're going to come together and we're going to make a treaty. And even when they had already made a treaty, they would say those same words. They would come together and they say, the Naudowik, the Haudenosaunee people came up here and they'd bring that belt and they'd lay it out and they'd say, this is what our ancestors had agreed upon. And then they would read that belt or read the talk of that belt. And then the host people, the Anishinaabe people, would get up and they would read that belt. And so after both parties had read that belt, then they say, now we are of one mind. So you understand that, eh? These are crawling along the bottom of the ocean floor. And then these ones are flying up high. And then that tree connects the sky with the earth and the roots go down deep. And then we make our pipe out of the stone. So it's the same with this. We use this purple part, and what I've been told is that now there was a guy, I talked to a guy who, when he was a child, he lived on the eastern seaboard. And when he was a child, he used to dive for these, and he'd pick them. And he said they used to be a lot deeper purple. And if you get the chance, maybe if some of you read some of these old archival documents, and it'll say gave a belt black, but none of the belts were black. This looks black, but it's a dark blue, but it was so blue that they called it black. But here you see it's not really all that purple. There's a lot of white in it. So the old shells used to get bigger, and they would get more of this purple, and they'd be able to make more beads out of it. So you can see that there's another shell actually that they use, and it's a different one, and that's where we get the white. I should have brought that other one. You ever see that? It looks like a top, and it has spikes on top, and then there's a tube in the middle of it, And so what I was told by a colleague of mine, a friend of mine named Rick Hill, he said that that one that's like a top, it goes along in the ocean and it feeds on this. And in the white part, it has a proboscis. And then it drills a hole in this, and then you'll find a quaog like this with a hole in it. And then that's when it drills a hole there, and then it sucks the life out of it, takes the actual edible part out of it and eats it. And so the purple part, like I was telling you earlier this morning, a lot of times the purple represents war or hard feelings or anger. And then the white represents peace, but they don't use this to make the white bead. They use that other shell that has that proboscis, then they're able to cut that up. And so they use two different shells to make purple wampum and white wampum. But the white that represents peace, you actually Google this or look it up on Wikipedia, and that shell actually kills this one. So what my friend Rick Hill was saying is, it's interesting that peace is the one that's able to kill war in the ocean floor. So that's what we ended up using as a motif here. And then what Jacques Cartier recorded, and he never knew if this was true, and nor do I, but he said what the Haudenosaunee would do when they wanted to get more wampum is they would kill a man. And when they killed that enemy, they cut him up. They cut up his body, and then they threw him in the salt water where the tide would come in. You always hear that, the tide's high, tide's low. They put him in the tide there, and they weigh him down. And then this quaog actually is carnivorous. It eats off meat. It looks for other meat on the ocean floor. So then this finds that man that's buried there, and then it starts going where the flesh is. It doesn't go on the skin, it goes on the flesh. And then once it's done that, they pull him up, and then they got a bunch of these shells without having to dive very far. So Jacques Cartier didn't know whether or not to believe that, and I'm just wanted to maintain your interest, so I told you that part too. But I don't know if that's true, of how they would do it, or if they dive down and they would get these shells on the ocean floor. But that's what Jacques Cartier was told about that. So the British ended up learning about how to make a treaty with us. So they didn't come here. They did try to come here and just take over. They thought they could just move in and be a boss. But then there was a Anishinaabe Odawa chief named Pontiac, and there was a Seneca chief named Gaya Soto. And both of these guys were influential war chiefs, and they ended up making a confederacy. And they gathered all different people, Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Seneca, Shawnee, and other people. And then they ended up taking surprise attacks, coordinated surprise attacks. They took over a number of different forts. And one of those was Fort Pitt, where Pittsburgh is, and the other was across the river here at Fort Michilimackinac. So if you ever get to hear that story about that, and you go over to Fort Michilimackinac, you'll hear somebody tell the story about how they played a game of lacrosse, and they made a ruse of it, and they ended up throwing the ball into the gates of the fort. They ran in there, stormed in, and then they ran back out. They threw the ball out, and they pretended that it was just part of the game. And then they did it again, but this time the women were all lined up at the gate, the doorway, and they had under their blankets guns and war clubs. And then all the Anishinaabe, as they went in, the women handed them weapons. And then the Anishinaabe went in that fort, stormed it, and then they killed many of the officers, and then others they took as prisoner. And then they would ransom those prisoners later. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, while that happened, it was the Ojibwe, and the Ojibwe chief was named Majiquis at that time, who was one of the principal ones that took over that fort at that time. And in our language, Majiquis means the oldest male in the family. And then also, Nanabush has a brother named Majikwis. Some say it's his father, but many say that's his oldest brother, and it's the wind. So Majikwis took over Fort Michilimackinac at that time. And then what they ended up saying is the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, and the Ho-Chunk, now people call them Winnebago, but in their own language they call themselves Ho-Chunk. So they had a fort over there, and then they sent them over. They said, we didn't want you to take that over. So they came and they brought those Calumet pipes, those big long stem pipes, and they also brought all kinds of wampum belts. So a lot of times the one thing I wanted to stress with you here, especially all you Anishinaabe that are here from Baoting, that we used wampum. It's not just a Haudenosaunee thing. It's not just a Six Nations thing. It's not just a Mi'kmaq or Mi'kmaq or Maliseet. It's actually an Anishinaabe. And this was diplomacy used throughout the Great Lakes as far as the Mississippi. And as early as the 1690s, we were using wampum here. And we spoke on strings of wampum, and we delivered strings of wampum to each other as a pledge of promise to our word. And then we also decorated them with that, decorated our pipes with that, even decorated our war clubs with that. So there's a war club in France, and it's got these beads studded right into the wampum, the war club. So there's a lot of what we would call diplomacy that's tied to wampum strings, wampum beads, and then wampum belts. So the one thing I wanted to also say here, we don't call this wampum belt. We don't wear it like this, like WWE. We don't. And how I said we used to do is like this. And these would have strings around here. So in museums, you'll see belts like this that are thinner. And then you'll see, if you go on the internet, you'll see a lot of pictures, and you look for Huron people, and you'll see they wear it like this. And then they have a bag here, and they tie these to the bag sometimes. So the French actually called this collar. Who speaks French here? How do you say collar in French? Yeah. So C-O-L-L-I-E-R is when you're reading the French and you say, then it'll say the speech, and it'll say the chief got up and the chef got up and said this, not the cooking chef, but the chief. And then it'll say collar. So then that's when you know they use wampum. So Michilimackinac was a place where they used a lot of wampum. And so their word for it instead of belt is actually closer, this collar that it's around. And so that's the other thing that they said. This guy, Haudenosaunee guy, Nottoway guy, came up and he wanted to make peace. And they had been at war. And he came up from his canoe. He landed his canoe on the beach. And he put all his belts up like this. And he started singing and talking to all the people on the shore. And he told them, I'm coming in peace. And like I mentioned this morning, when you showed wampum, nobody was allowed to touch you. Nobody was allowed to kill you, even if you were in active war. And if somebody came into the battlefield like this, they were not to be touched. And then that was a signal for peace. So that's how powerful these belts were at that time, that everyone abided by them. And in our language, the word for belt is Gjipizuin. So Gjipizuin is like what I'm wearing here. You put on a belt, you get a belt buckle, but that just means it girds you, it holds in your gut. But in our language, we call this miigis a pikkan. And now in our language, pikkanan is a harness for a horse. But we had what we call this was a tump line. So when you say this, it's like this. This is a tump line. You put a load on your back, eh? You put this, the miigis, the tump line of wampum. And so a thump line is used to carry things out of the bush, heavy things out of the bush. And so actually for us, what this means is the message is the burden. The message is the thing that's being carried, and that's what's the heavy part. So when you had different people, Anishinaabe people that carried these belts, they had to do a lot of memorization, and they had to remember a lot of the words that went with this. And they were expected to do this. And a lot of non-native people wrote about it. And they said it's amazing to see the Anishinaabe people or the Haudenosaunee people, when they come to a conference, they don't know letters. They don't know numbers, they say. They don't know any writing. He said, so what they do is they have one young man, another young man, and another young man who is assigned to memorize certain parts of that speech that is given. So it would have been this guy's job to learn the first part, this guy's job to learn the next part, and then this guy's job to learn the next part. And then these three get together again, and then they recite it with each other. And then they say, the non-native people used to say, it's with remarkable accuracy that when they come back the following year or the year after, that they're able to say exactly what was said at that time. But it was because they worked at it, they used their mind, their ears, their eyes, and their mouth, of course, and their heart. So they would say that everyone memorized the whole speech, but these three were the ones that went to the meeting. These three come back to the community, they meet with their elders, then they tell them what went on, and they recite what they were told to memorize, and then the rest of their community knows that. So where are you from?
Me?
Yeah.
Grand River.
So like today, if it was your job, you would have had to memorize this part, and the rest of your people aren't here today. But when you go home, then that's when you got to tell them that part. And then if you're with her, you tell them the next part, so that you have a meeting about it, and then you all share what went on at that treaty meeting or that council. That's how this was done back then. And then if this was exchanged, then that's when you know how far you were to talk about and how far the next person was to talk about, and the following person, till you all put it all together. And nobody at that time were writing. They weren't writing any of this down. They used their mind and their heart for this, and their ears. So that's why they would say sometimes, and it was an Odawa chief by the name of Siganok who said about this particular belt. He said that Sir William Johnson, who was what we would call the first Minister of Indian Affairs, now we have a Minister of Indian Affairs. Anybody know her name? Oh, I shouldn't have said her name. Now you gave you a clue. Anybody know her name? Carolyn Bennett. So Carolyn Bennett's predecessor from long ago was the one that gave us this belt on behalf of the King of England, King George III. And he gave us this belt, and then when the Siganok recited this, he said, you see that belt, the body of my words. That's how they would refer to these belts, the body of my words, or the spirit of my talk. So they knew to look at this, what this all meant, and they were able to recite that. And they referred to it as being a conveyor of words, just like how a piece of paper did that as well. So some of the first treaties or land cessions, like the treaty for the island of Michilimackinac, there was a long wampum belt that went with it, as well as a treaty where they marked their totems down on it. And then the other thing that they would do is they would then mark on there what the transaction was, and so they were able to memorize that. But then do you know what happens when somebody takes this away? And you memorize this part, and then you memorize this part, and then somebody memorized the other part, and then they take this away and they put it in a museum. And then you don't get to take it to Garden River, and you don't get to visit with it and take it to your old people, what happens? You forget about it. You don't get to talk about it. You don't get to share it. Then you end up forgetting about it. And then that's what happened with us. So the original belt of this is called the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. And it was kept by the Odawa people who were initially around what they call Larbour Cross, which is at, now they call that place Harbor Springs or Cross Village on the American side of the river here. And it was the Odawa people that were given this belt in 1764. But what Sir William Johnson did at that time, he said in the meeting at Niagara, this was all conducted at Niagara to conclude or to stop the war that is called Pontiac's War. So he had this belt made. Sir William Johnson had this belt made, and he met with who he called the Western nations. And he said, now all that is left for us to do is to tie our hands together in friendship and for you to take hold of the covenant chain. And they said he had a belt there. I forget how many feet long he said it was at that time. And he says, I make this belt, I tie one end of this belt at the falls of Sault Ste. Marie. The other end of this belt, I tie to my house at Johnsonville in New York State. And he says, and if there's anything that you want from me, or if there's any problems that you have, any time you need to seek justice, shake this belt, and I know that you want something. So he said he put this down, and then he says, he told the Ojibwe chief to take this. He didn't write down who the Ojibwe chief was at that time, but he said the Ojibwe chief got up at Niagara in 1764, and he says, this belt should not belong at Sault Ste. Marie. It should actually belong and be kept with our older brother, the Odawa, at the island of Michilimackinac. And then, so that's why this belt ended up being under the care of the Odawa people at Michilimackinac. So, to be a real fast retelling of history, the Odawa keep this from 1764 all the way up to 1884. And then after that, that's the last sighting of the original belt of this. And then the chiefs all would get together, and they actually had a meeting at Garden River in 1869, and they had this belt out. And they wrote down all their grievances. Because what this belt, there's a lot of people talk about this belt now, and they say it represents alliance and friendship. And it does represent that. But it actually represents our Aboriginal title to the land. It actually also represents our Aboriginal right to hunt and fish. And it also represents that the British are going to protect us from themselves. They said they would protect us from themselves. That anybody who was mining or speculating or fur trading and trying to cheat us, they said it was the king's representative, the job of the king's representative to intercede and to bring us justice. So that's what this belt means. It means a lot more than just friendship and unity. It actually represents our Aboriginal title. And that's why Signal said when he mentioned this, that the body of my words, the spirit of my words. You see that belt, and he says, I clothe your land, and you'll never be poor. You'll never sink into poverty, he says, with this belt. So, this belt was almost kept here at Sault Ste. Marie with Ojibwe people. But at that particular council meeting, it actually was decided that it should be kept with the Odawa people at Michilimackinac. And then when it went to Michilimackinac, after the American Revolution, Michilimackinac was no longer British territory, or the British couldn't set up there. The Americans were told to vacate the Americans told the British to vacate the island. And then when they did that, this belt then, and a council fire, this represents a council fire as well. The council fire of Michilimackinac was moved to St. Joseph's Island. So if any of you do a field trip and you go to St. Joseph's Island, you'll see the ruins of the fort there. And so from 1796 to 1815, the presents that the British promised us were delivered there. And if you stand up where the ruin of that chimney is, and just look around, look east, south, west, and then look north, and then just imagine 3,000 Anishinaabe there. Just imagine 3,000 wigwams camped there, all kinds of canoes, and people all around, and then imagine all these fires where people would be fed. And then imagine there rows of people seated, and then chiefs getting up, and that's what they would do. They would recite this belt. They would recite the promises that are on this belt, and then they would also end up getting fed, and they would get clothed. So the British would come and they would deliver leggings. They would cut cloth for leggings, for shirts, for skirts. They'd give us ribbons, silk ribbon, and they'd give us hats, chief's hats, silk hats, and they'd give women combs, needles, butcher knives. They'd give us guns, and they'd even give us nets. And I want you to think about that and remember that with this belt, the British promised to give us what they called presents every year. But some people call that a form of rent, that every year they had to come to our area, to our territory, and they had to give us cloth. And they always gave us tobacco as well, and they gave us those tomahawk pipes, they gave us guns. And the reason they did that is because they knew, can you guess why? They knew who owned the land. Said, we're living on your land, here's our payment to you for living on your land. Here's so that we still have peace. Here's cloth for all your kids, here's cloth for your old ladies, here's some cloth for your old men, here's hunting knives for your young men, here's guns for your hunters, and here's net for your fishers. And here as well are even canvas, or they call it Russia or Scotch sheeting, to cover your wigwams or to make sails for your boat. So what I want you to remember is they'd even give us fish hooks, mackerel lines, cod lines, and then after that, that's why I say this also represents our Aboriginal right to hunt and fish, because they're turning around and from 1764 to 1854, they're giving us guns, they're giving us nets, they're giving us cod lines, they're giving us hooks, they gave us everything to hunt and fish on the land. And actually they expected us to do that. And that's why we say this belt doesn't just represent friendship, and it doesn't just mean we're holding hands and not making nice. This actually represents that the British came and they had said to us at that time, they said, Nui kanash kawa mabe wabe medabit get I'm going to chase away anybody who comes to your great lake. That's what the British told us. So they told us that anybody that comes to our territory, they knew that they had to get permission from us. And the British at that time had said, we abide by this. So that's why you'll hear different people talk about the Royal Proclamation, because in that Royal Proclamation of King George, he also mentions that the lands are reserved as their hunting territories to the said Indians. But to our version of the treaty is this wampum belt. Now you're going to hear people say that a treaty, he said there is no Treaty of Niagara because there's no document. There's no document with signed signatures, and nobody signed with their totem or anything else like that. But before we used paper, this was our treaty. And getting together, visiting each other, feeding each other, feasting with one another, this was the treaty. And every year, 1764 to 1854, the British came to deliver presents at Michilimackinac, and then after the American Revolution, they delivered the presents to St. Joseph's Island. Then after the War of 1812, they delivered the presents to Drummond Island. And then after 1836, they delivered the presents at Manitoulin Island. And each time they moved where the place of delivering the presents, they said, you moved your council fire. You moved your council fire. The king established a council fire. And then likewise at Detroit, and then after Detroit became American territory, they moved their council fire to Amherstburg, which is just south of Detroit. Likewise here, on the eastern side, they had a council fire at Niagara, and that's Fort Niagara. And then it was on what it was now called the American side. Then they moved that to the Canadian side, to Fort Mississauga, and that's where they delivered these presents. And the same thing over at Montreal and Fort Pitt. So that's what these council fires also represent. And then what they had said at that time, Sir William Johnson had also said, instead of just, you'll see this belt on the internet, and you'll see that some people now, when they made this belt, they don't have this center part, and that it looks like chain links. But why that's in there, Sir William Johnson said, I now take the dish, meaning the dish with one spoon, and I place it at the council fire at Niagara, at Detroit, at Michilimackinac, so that you won't have to feed yourselves there. And they always would give us provisions at that time. So there's a lot more to talk about. And then when I say here that each chief used to know this. It wasn't just the wampum keeper, because each time they came to council with the British, they heard these speeches, and then the British were the ones to then get up and recite this as well, and then also to tell us any news or change in policy at that time. So, who's a good reader? You're a good reader? All right. They were going to make this in 1852. See at the bottom where your thumb is? It says Xinghua Cons.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you when to start reading. So when they came up to Manitoulin and they said in 1852, we're going to stop giving you presents. They had cutbacks back then. They were saying it costs, all through this time they kept saying the Indian presents cost too much, get rid of them. And so what they ended up doing is the British ended up saying, you're an American Indian, you live on the state side, you don't get any presents. And then the chief said, no, you were the one who asked me to fight alongside you against the Chimokmanen, against the Americans. That's what they told him. He says, you're the one who did, now you're supposed to pay me for that. So they tried to cut the American Anishinaabe that came across to Drummond Island to get their presents, even though they fought with them during the War of 1812. And then after that, anybody who wasn't married to an Anishinaabe who was married to a Jaganash or a Wemtagosh, a British or a Frenchman, they said, you don't get presents either. So that's when they started cutting these presents. And then in 1852, they announced at Mantowaning that they're going to stop giving these presents. And then you can read there.
I am one of those people assembled here this day, the Ottawas, Patawotoms, and Chippeways who live on this island and the shore of the Lake Huron, all cast down their heads in sorrow at the news which has reached them. The night before last, we, all the old men of our people, assembled to smoke together and speak of what was best to be done. At once we said, let us go, chief. Our great mother has sent among us is one of us. The blood of the red man flows in his veins. He will lay our words before her, strive that they shall be heard. Before your people stood upon these broad lands, once all ours, another nation from far beyond the sea had settled upon our shores. You came and he disappeared, but you said to the red man, be you now in my care, be you now my children, that all the French have done for you, much more will I do. Let the red warriors cleave to me, and shall never know want. We heard your words. We believed what you said. You see the sun above us, who shines to light and warm us. You see those green leaves which open out beneath his rays. You see that grass which clothes the earth, those waters which flow from the highlands towards the sea. Well, whilst these things live in your presence, shall live. Can it be that this is forgotten? Shall the Indian no longer be able to draw home, which it has so often gladdened, amplify frighted, vessel which was bound by the strong cord of friendship, much to agitate, which you told him should make it appear? No, it cannot be so, and now again I appeal to you, whose blood is that of red man. I appeal to you, who have cast your lot among us, whose children have the red blood of their Indian mother. I appeal to you, who have been so often sent by our great mother to distribute his bounty. I ask you one and all, in the name of the chiefs here assembled, to add your prayers to ours, to help us in our need, to send our thoughts to our great Father, that this thing may not be. If you withhold the supply we have so long received, which we were promised forever, your poor children will return to their former miserable clothing of hare skins, and they can neither make the cloth nor the blanket which protects from the winter blast. This is all I will say now. We hope that our great Father will listen to our words or grant us permission to appear before him. Tell us of the treaties of former days, of the promises of your first men, Hiltoth, considered so sacred by us. We salute you. We beg of you to believe what we say, for though we cannot put down our thoughts on paper as you, our wampum and our records of old men are as undying as your writings. They do not deceive.
Miigwech. So that's that's my favorite quote. And this is Chief Shingwa Kons of Garden River, who had said this in August of 1852 at Manitowoc. Says, we beg of you to believe what we say, for though we cannot put down our thoughts on paper as you, our wampum and the records of our old men are as undying as your writings, and they do not deceive. So that's the main part that I want to leave you off with. There's more to talk about. He's talking about the presence. The other thing is that it's this belt I showed you where this actual, he's talking about this ship. And he says that all he'd have to do is to merely agitate that rope. And he said you would bring that vessel forward. And that's the boat that Shingwa Kons is talking about. And all 24 nations here, the 12 of these are the Western nations. The other 12 are Eastern. So here, like Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Wendat, Sioux, Cree, Ho-Chunk, Sauk, Fox, Nipissing, and Algonquin. These are all the Western nations that were part of this. And then there's the Eastern nations, like the Six Nations and others. But all that boat would be full of presents and ammunition and guns and net and thread and everything that we needed, box combs, needles, thread, butcher knives and knives. So he said that's what they were told. You're not going to get these presents anymore. But they had been getting them for 90 years at that point. And they understood it to be that was like a form of rent. So you hear people now say, as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the waters flow. And now you heard Shingwa Kons say that can it be that the sun is still rolling across the sky and the leaves that unfurl before its warmth and all the waters that flow from the height of land down to the sea, that these things are still living, and once these things live, your presence shall live. And that's what he's referring to, is this wampum belt here, and the British promised that they would outfit us every year for all of time while they lived here. And some say as long as the British wore red, these presents would be in effect. So how many of you from Garden River here or Batchewana? And how many of you get that $4 a year?
Well, when you're 18, you'll get treaty money.
Yeah, and when you get that treaty money, or if you've ever gone with your parents to get that treaty money, do you know who's standing there? Yeah, RCMP. And you know why RCMP is there instead of the police? Because he's wearing red. And it's these promises that were made to the, what we call Mescokunyet, the red coats. And they said, as long as the British wear red, these promises are in effect. So that's why these RCMP are there to deliver out the $4 a year, and that's part of the treaty promise. Some of them, the RCMP officers that are there don't understand that. They don't know that. They just get a sign, go there. They're dispersing this treaty money, you got to be there. But that's what this is. It's all like when you go into court and the judge comes in after and then they say, all rise. It's all this processional stuff, and that's what that part is when that RCMP officer is there and he's wearing that scarlet red, he's representing the British Army of times when this was a treaty of alliance, of defensive and offensive alliance, and that's what he's representing there. So I got the signal that I'm done. So miigwech minwag bezinde mek kene enchiek Anishinaabe sak minwag jalganashin sak wem to go ji sak up to go gikche miigwech and dam minwag gikchen and dam gibejaya mampi kinomage gamagong. It's really nice. I had a good feeling coming here. You all made me feel welcome, and you all listened. All of you really listened well, and were very respectful, and I thank you all for that. And as well, Carol and Darren for bringing me here, asking me to come talk to young people. A lot of times I'm talking to adults, and then sometimes, like tomorrow, I'm going to be talking to bureaucrats, and I actually prefer, I want younger people, especially young Anishinaabe people, to learn this and to understand this, as well as young non-native people, because they don't get to hear this, and they don't understand, later on, they don't understand the role that was made. And so when they hear this about this treaty and they hear covenant chain, sometimes they just think alliance. But what I'm trying to show you here is when you hear about, oh, Indians get free education, oh, Indians get free Medicare. And it's like, this is all part of this, because the British promised us that they were going to take care of us. And like when you read Shingwalk's speech there, he said, cleave you young warriors to me. I'll protect you, I'll take care of you, even better than the French had. And so that's part of that promise of taking better care of us than they ever did, than the French did. So, that's about as much as I talk about today.